Today I'm talking about dealing with GA4 quotas in Looker Studio, okay? As Phil mentioned, this is me, Ahmad Kanani, my friend and family, they call me Siavash. I live in Budapest with my lovely wife and cute dog, and I run Siawak Analytics, which is a boutique analytics agency. And usually if you see me during the day, I'm drinking coffee, spending time in BigQuery and Looker Studio. That's all about me. I've a lot to cover and just 30 minutes, so let's begin. Today, I'm going to talk about GA4 reporting in Looker Studio. Universal is going away. Everyone knows that. We will be left with the data that we're collecting in our GA4 properties, and we want to report on it in Looker Studio or any other tool, right? To do so, we need to extract data, the data that we've collected from Google Analytics 4. And we've got almost two only possible ways, either API or BigQuery. API, we know about that. We're going to talk about that. BigQuery is the free GA4 export to BigQuery that happens every day, raw data, and also in close to real time into the intraday tables. It is free. It happens automatically, easy to enable. If you're going to connect to the API to extract data, we can use Google Connector within Looker Studio, or we can write a script to hit the API request for data and retrieve data. If we want to use BigQuery, we cannot directly work with that raw data, so we need to create a do-it-yourself data pipeline, SQL workflow, and things like that in BigQuery before our data is ready for reporting in Looker Studio. So there is some learning curve and cost and time involved. We'll talk about that. There are other solutions which are third-party connectors, and we will talk about those as well, which can be warehoused or cached, and which can retrieve data from either the API or some of them also from the BigQuery export of GA4. Each one of these solutions to bring in data, extract data for the reporting in Looker Studio or any other tool have their pros and cons, and I'm going to talk about that. So the key takeaways for today, right? What are GA4 API quotas? What we're going to talk about, what is it? Are you affected? I'm going to help you figure out if you're affected, and if you're affected, to what extent you're affected. So should you care, and to what extent? And I'm going to give you some information to figure out how to deal with the quotas if you're affected in Looker Studio. We're going to understand the pros and cons of connecting to the API versus connecting to BigQuery export. And we're going to also understand the pros and cons of Google Connector versus third-party connectors, either warehoused, live, or cached, right? Today, I'm going to give you information, not prescriptions. So it's not that I'm going to tell you this is the correct way of doing it. I'm going to give you enough information for you so you can decide for yourself what you need to do and what is the best course of action for your specific situation. Okay, let's begin. What are quotas? November 7th, 2022, about 6 months before we were working in Looker Studio, our reports connected to GA4 were working fine, everything was fine, until people started getting this error message. Looker Studio cannot connect to your dataset. Suddenly, the GA4 API quotas were enforced on Looker Studio. There were always quotas for every other software connecting to the API, but not for Looker Studio for a while. But Google decided to level the field, so anyone is connecting to the API, they're subject to quotas, they're subject to limits. And suddenly, reports that were working fine yesterday, they were not working at all. So people believe that it's a bug, everyone was impacted, everyone was angry, frustrated, and people started looking for solutions. So why these quotas are causing issues and what are the limits? Let's understand them a little bit more. In Google Analytics 4, we have an account and we've got properties, right? Each website, a stream, there can be properties connected to different streams and websites and apps, but we've got properties on one side, which we want to extract data from. We've got projects like Looker Studio. So in this context, Looker Studio is a project that wants to connect to the API and extract data from that property. Now, other tools are also subject to the quotas. So do not think that it's only Looker Studio. Anything, a Google Sheet, a scripts that you wrote, any third-party connector, if they're going to hit the API, they are subject to quotas. Each one of these projects are subject to kind of three types of more important quotas and other quotas as well. But the three most important ones are first the concurrent request quotas per property. So each property, think of it as a person. They would say that if you're gonna, ask a question from me, you can ask 10 questions at the same time. I'm not gonna respond to more than 10 questions. I'm not gonna respond to more than 10 requests at the same time, right? That is my limit. I cannot do more than that. I'm done. So you cannot make more than 10 requests in a standard property to the API from all the projects combined. But the rest of the quotas are token-based and per project. So Lucra Studio as a project, every hour, it has some kind of limit, some kind of currency of tokens that it can spend. Any request that goes to the GA4 API, it consumes a certain number of tokens. There is no rule for that. There's no hard rule for that, so that you can know this request consumed this many tokens. But we will see ways of figuring it out. And on top of that, on a daily basis, each project has a limit of tokens to consume per property. Okay. So these are the three main types of quotas that are enforced on Looker Studio and every other tool. Now, request is a request. We know, we send a request to the API, we get a response, we can kind of visualize that. We know one request is one request. So what is a token? Depending each request that goes from a chart to a data connector to the API of GA4, depending on multiple factors like the complexity of the request, the number of dimensions and metrics that you're asking for in that request, the filters that you apply, and the date range from which you are requesting data, it consumes less or more tokens. Okay, so this is something to keep in mind. One request is not one token. Google says, according to Google, most requests will use around 10 tokens, but in reality, for a table, for a chart that is complex enough, you can expect anywhere between 20 tokens, 50 tokens, and in some cases that we will see up to 100 token or even more for high volume accounts. Okay, so one request can be 100 tokens at one time. Now, what are the limits? If we are limited on the number of tokens, what are the limits? The good news is 3 weeks ago, the limits, they were increased by about 10x, 12x, or 8x, depending on the type of quota. So the situation right now is a little bit more bearable, right? The impact is less, especially on the standard properties, but it's still, you might be affected. For concurrent requests, questions at the same time, 10, it has not been increased. So it was 10, right now it's 10. You cannot ask more than 10 questions at the same time. Tokens per project, per property, per hour. Every hour, Looker Studio can consume 14,000 tokens, which is quite nice. It's workable. But before, 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, it was 1,250. It was unworkable. It would break any report, kind of almost immediate, any serious report. And per property per hour, and we also have per property per day. For Analytics 360, if you're paying Google, I bet you already know that, but if you don't know, if you're paying Google, you get 5x concurrent request quotas and 10x the token-based quotas, which should be enough for most use cases, unless you're dealing with like millions of hits and events and sessions per day, or even more than that. There's a link here. You can search for it. There's a list of all current GA API quotas. If you're watching it, I don't know, after a few months, there might have changed. So the updated version can be found on Google's website. Something to note is that the concurrent request is only per property. It is not per project. So different project, a Google Sheet, a script, a third-party connector, a SaaS platform, your Looker Studio, all trying to connect to the same property at the same time, even if each one of them sends 3 questions and it is more than 10, you will hit the quota limit for that property. So you need to keep all your usage in mind when dealing with concurrent requests per property. Now, what happens? You hit the quota, what happens? Do you get a warning? I mean, does it get upset? You get error. Your charts in Looker Studio, they basically do not load. And if you click on this see details, you'll start getting errors like this: quota error, dataset configuration error, quota error. It's been accessed too many times, and basically you cannot load your report, or worse than that, your client cannot load the report and they will get angry, which is not good. So it's important for you to understand and for me to help you understand, are you affected? And if you're affected, to what extent? Let's figure it out. How likely is your report, your dashboards, your properties are to hit the quota limits? First of all, let me start with good news, people that are less likely to be affected or less affected. If you create simple report, very simple report, if you deal with a small volume account, like hundreds or thousands of events or views or sessions or users per day, if you report on shorter date ranges, a week, 4 weeks, up to a quarter, something like that, if your reports are going to be viewed by few viewers per hour. So you create reports for a company, for a small company, they only have 3 people on their team. And I mean, it's unlikely for them to want to access the report all at the same time or within the same hour. So it's kind of spread throughout the day. It's a good situation to be on. If you use free components per page, this is a good practice. Just use that one page dedicated to one question or one group of questions and use your components per page. Pages are free in Looker Studio. They've always been free. They are free. Break your report into pages so you do not send multiple requests that are unnecessary for the whole page through. And most importantly, if your reports are informational, what do I mean by that? If you have a report that is going to inform a person of what happens, like last month, how many sessions, revenue, users, or whatever you had, and that's it. The date range is fixed. There's no filter. There's no interactivity or low interactivity. And people consume the report and then they just closed it. It's good because the result can be cached. The data can be cached. We'll learn about caching a little bit later on. And it helps with not hitting the API quotas. The situation that we don't like to be in are the situations that are likely to hit the quotas. More complicated reports, more complex reports, dealing with higher volume accounts, hundreds of thousands of users per day, millions of users per day, trying to report on longer date ranges, year on a daily basis. Sharing your report with many viewers per hour is important. So you have a report, you're sharing with like, I don't know, 60 department managers, and all of them, they want to look at the report in the morning, 7 a.m. So it would be 60 people trying to access a report within the same hour. So you are more likely to hit the hourly quotas. And if you use many components per page, if they ask complex questions, they spend tokens more easily. And again, more importantly, if your reports are made for exploration, if they are highly interactive reports, because if you have a report with a, if it's meant to be used like changing the date range or cross-filtering or clicking some buttons and filtering and using a drop-down menu, slicing and dicing data, trying to figure out something, answer different types of questions. For each of those interactions, Looker Studio requires to ask for new data. It cannot be fetched from cache because that question hasn't been answered before, right? It doesn't have data in the cache to save it from cache. So when the same report is made for exploration, made for interaction, is highly interactive, it means that it's very, very more likely to hit the quotas, okay? Here, you can come back to this slide later. I'm not going to spend too much time on it. I tried to kind of perform a simplistic simulation with lots of assumptions to see, okay, we know the more we use it, the worse is the situation, but how bad it is. So assume that your report is going to be used by 10 users per hour at max. And on average, each of one of your components uses 20 tokens when it's refreshed. Now, this is the number of components that you have on your page, and this is the number of interactions or refreshes per user per hour per property, okay? Dealing with one property would be per user per hour. So you can see that in case of Analytics 360, even when you are having like 15 or 20 components per page, you're almost in a safe zone. Each user can interact with the report within that hour. But if you're on a standard and you have lots of components, you have lots of people using the reports, maybe each one of them can interact with that report only 4 times, right? This is not a good position to be. So keep in mind, use fewer components per page, share it with less people, or wait for some solutions that we're going to cover. And keep in mind, this is per property. This is not per report page. This is not per report. If you have 10 dashboards connected to the same property, and each one of them is shared with like 10 people, you have 100 people that are likely to hit that property within an hour, okay? Let's move on. So we understood about the quotas, and we understood kind of some criteria to figure out if we are affected. How Looker Studio is helping us handle the Quota, because Looker Studio team is different from GA4 team. They also, like us, they figured out that now they're subject to quotas, and they tried to ship features and come up with solutions that helps lives easier for their users, which is us. First of all, how Looker Studio deals with concurrent request quotas. Here I have 12 scorecards. Each one of them is making 2 requests, one for the main date range, one for the comparison date range, because it needs to get data to calculate the percentage difference. So I've got 24 requests at the same time whenever I load this page. And we know that for a standard property, it's 10, so it's more than twice. What Looker Studio does, it breaks the loading of the components and requests into batches. So each batch sends less than 10 requests at a time. And it waits for one batch of requests to be completed. And then it requests like 4 more scorecards. And this is the kind of experience that a user might have. Is it okay for your users? I don't know. For some of my users, they get angry if it happens. Some of them are fine with it. So again, is this enough for your use case or not? Also, Looker Studio came up with a solution for monitoring the token usage, because again, we didn't know and we didn't have any way of understanding how many tokens are being consumed by a single request or by a component. But now, if you right-click on a page, on a report, or on a single component, you can see that in that session, which is not a Google Analytics session, it's like the session of using that Looker Studio report, how many tokens were consumed, how many tokens were consumed by that page, or by the final situation, final refresh on that page. You can see 97. This was just one table, okay? Then you can see the remaining tokens per day, per hour, which is spread between different projects. We know Looker Studio is just one project, so this is actually more relevant. We've got 10,881 remaining, and this specific table use 650, and in the final refresh, most recent request 97. So what kind of table is that? I right-clicked on the table and grabbed some data. We can see the usage per component as well. So each one of these rows is a refresh of this table, and we can see anywhere from 61, 81, 82, up to 97 tokens were consumed. By a simple table like this: date, user source, session source, event, event revenue, and count. 4 dimension, 2 metrics. The date range was long. I admit it was about 14 months, but you can see that none of these could be saved from cache because I was editing the table. I was changing the configuration of the table. The new configuration couldn't have been answered with the previous request. So every time it has to send every new request and consume tokens, okay? Another one, which is very much recent, is the ability to pause updates. And by pause updates, I mean pause request. Because the editors of the report, when they are editing, they change configurations like I was doing with that table. And every time they hit the API, they hit the API, they hit the API, they consume tokens. And if it's a live report, then the viewers cannot look at that because the tokens are already exhausted. Now, if you're working on a report, you can pause updates. It does not send any more requests, and because of that, it cannot render your charts when you change the configuration unless and until you resume the updates, and then based on the most recent configuration, it will get data from the API, okay? And finally, caching in Looker Studio. So for the same request, same date range, same metrics and dimensions, and same filters applied, if Looker Studio already has data, according to the data freshness setting at the data source. So for each data source, like GA4 data source, we can configure data freshness setting, 12 hours, 4 hours, every hour. And if we are within that time frame, and Looker Studio already has answers for those questions, it's not going to ask Google Analytics anymore. It says, okay, I have the data, I will save it from cache, it is faster, and it will save tokens. So know that you can set the data freshness in Looker Studio for your data to be cached. Solutions. Now, we know what are the limitations, what we need to deal with, what Looker Studio did to help us. Now, what can we do to help ourselves, especially if we're affected, okay? Solutions. Pay Google. The easiest solution, the most costly solution. Some people believe that if they upgrade to Looker Studio Pro, it's going to be better. No, misconception, doesn't change a thing. Looker Studio Pro is just another project. It's just another software. The level The field is level. I mean, every software is subject to the same quotas. It doesn't change a thing. It has some, pros for itself, but it's not about quotas. Upgrade to Analytics 360. I mean, it used to be hundreds of thousands of dollars per year. It's still, I hear it's cheap, not cheaper, more affordable, but still it would be so much money. But it will increase your token-based quotas by 10x and concurrent by 5x. But again, if the only reason you want to pay Google is to work around quotas, there are better ways to spend your money, and we'll get to that. Okay. So solution one, pay Google. Solution two, build a solution for yourself. Build something from scratch based on the data that Google is providing you in BigQuery. Okay. So can we do this? Google Analytics is sending data for free to BigQuery every day and in real time. That's good. We have Looker Studio. It can connect to BigQuery. That's also good. But we need to know the schema. We need to know SQL. We need to be able to create a workflow, a SQL workflow in BigQuery to prepare this data into final tables that are useful for Looker Studio. It is not, I cannot say it's not possible. It's not feasible. It's not useful to directly connect Looker Studio to your BigQuery table and start querying it. It will be costly, and you cannot really get the answers that you want, and it won't be fast anyway, right? So depending on the time, the money, the skills that you have yourself or in your team, and the resources that you have, and you can allocate to creating a solution like this, you can decide to build a BigQuery data warehouse for yourself. There are pros. I mean, I cannot deny that. You have data ownership. I mean, you will have data ownership even if you just enable exporting data from GA4. I mean, but if you're not using it, that ownership is not, I mean, yeah, it's not useful. So you have useful data ownership. You can use SQL for data analysis, for segmentation, etc. For segmentation, we cannot apply a segment through API. Done. Looker Studio cannot apply a segment through API, either through Google connector or third-party connectors. Technically, if you know the schema, if you know SQL, you can apply a segment if you know what you're doing. So it is possible. I'm not saying it's easy. It's possible to apply segments, perform segmentation analysis. It's possible to apply any kind of data analysis that you know how to do, knowing the schema and knowing SQL. Okay, so it's a good thing. It's a pro. You are free to do whatever you want. There is no limit on the storage or processing. Why no limit? Because you're paying for it. You're paying for storage. You're paying for processing. Whenever you're paying for something, usually there is no limit. The speed. It can be blazing fast if you know what you're doing. If you can create an optimized solution, which I've rarely seen, but if you know how to kind of cache data, if you know how to use views and materialize views and schedule queries and create native tables, etc., you can create a solution that is blazing fast and can leverage the BigQuery's BI engine. It is possible, but it's not that if you use BigQuery, by default, it would be blazing fast. You can do it wrong way. It can be even slower than the API. Cons, cost. You have upfront cost for creating a solution. You have cost for storage and processing. I mean, the storage you will have anyway if you enable data export, but processing depends on how optimized your queries are. You can spend a lot on processing or something that is worthwhile your actual use case. Time to value and complexity is high. Even getting a single metric broken down by a simple dimension takes so much more time doing it this way rather than just hitting the API or using a third-party connector. Maintenance is a solution that you've built. You're responsible for it. No one's going to maintain it for you. You have to manage, monitor, optimize the cost, the speed, everything. And discrepancy. It is hard to match the result that you get this way to the UI of GA4 or the result from the API. Why? Because Google Analytics 4 also has a raw data set, a raw database of what you've collected. When you send an API request and ask for several dimensions and metrics with attribution and etc., it needs to process, it needs to apply a logic like SQL on that database to find the answer and give you the answer. We never know what that logic exactly is. We are just recreating a similar logic with our own SQL, which is always different from what Google uses in the background, especially with black boxes like data-driven attribution or whatever processing that Google signals and whatever that we don't know how it's being processed. Number of events per day, easy peasy. Anything really serious, you will get another answer that you can get through the API or user interface. Okay, so know about these. Now, just to give you a quick example, this is how complicated it is to get a single metric for a date range, the 28-day active users from the raw export table using SQL. So you have to write SQL like this. And if it's getting any more complicated, like applying breakdowns, sessions, countries, cities, etc., it will get more complicated very soon. So this is what to expect. Getting the same answer is harder and more complicated through BigQuery. But if you have the will to go this route, do not do it alone. Use one of these resources or many other resources that are out on the internet. GA4BigQuery.com. Johan has lots of good tutorials and sample queries for you to understand the schema, know how to write the queries yourself. I mean, most of them are mainly built for one-time analysis, not optimized for connecting to Looker Studio. But I mean, you have to know what you're doing and tweak those queries for Looker Studio usage, especially with filtering and cross-filtering and slice and dicing data. GA4SQL.com, Analytics Canvas, and GA4BQ.com. These are all services that allow you to use a drag and drop or click interface to just select your dimension and metric. This is from Analytics Canvas, and it will write the SQL for you that you can run against your BigQuery export. And you can see how complicated it can be just with a few dimensions and metrics. So it's good, thank God, that these solutions exist, and I will bet more will be available very soon. Another solution, if you don't want to build it yourself, you're gonna buy it or rent it. There are warehoused or cached third-party data connectors. That they have advantages over Google Connector, the free one, and over BigQuery, the most flexible and time-consuming one. They help us stay below the quota limits and keep the data flowing. This is an advantage versus Google Connector. And by third-party connector, I'm talking about something like Supermetrics, Power Analytics, 2-minute reports, Datadog, and other data connectors that are available for Looker Studio. They help us, if they are cached, if they're warehoused, they help us stay below GA4 API quota limits. And this, they also require less time, cost, and expertise to utilize because they're commercial products. They're meant to be easy to use. So they're much more easier to use and cheaper than BigQuery, going the BigQuery route. Okay. They've got better API coverage. The API usually announces that new fields and dimensions are added to the GA4 API, but usually the Google Analytics connector, the built-in connector in Looker Studio, is very delayed in adding those fields to the API, but the commercial third-party connectors, they're usually very fast because that is their advantage. Usually within days or weeks, they will add things like landing page or new UTMs that are available through the API into their connector. But if you're with the free connector that Looker Studio provides, it takes weeks or months to add those fields to the connector. Data ownership, if you use a warehouse solution, it's an advantage over Google Connector. And speed and user experience. The Google Connector, the free connector, even if you do not hit the quota limits, can be very slow when the report is interactive. When you select different date range or apply cross-filtering or choose something from a drop-down menu, it can take up to 10 seconds or more for the data to be refreshed. But if your data is already cached in a warehouse or in a data connector, and you're going to connecting to the cache and not the API, it can be very fast and a better experience for your users. Okay. Some examples of buying a solution, a warehouse connector. First of all, Analytics Canvas. That is by far my favorite because of the things that I'm going to talk about here. They're specialized in Google Analytics. That's basically the only thing they do. They've been doing it for 10 years or more. Their data connector is warehouse, so it is not just cached. You actually take a snapshot of the extracted data, keep it in a warehouse, and Looker Studio hits the warehouse, their warehouse, not API anymore. The warehouse can be managed on their BigQuery. It can be on your BigQuery, depending on the plan. They've got data transformation and workflow builder, like in any user interface, which is easy to use. I mean, there is a learning curve, but it's easy enough to use, easier than writing SQL your own. It does historical backfill. I've already told you that it has the query builder. They recently came up with the universal historical data export. Some people believe that it's a waste of time to export UA data. Some people need it. So anyway, it's possible. And one thing that is very special about Analytics Canvas is that it connects to both the API and to the BigQuery extracted table, which is really nice. So if you want to do something with the export, like segmentation analysis, you can do that. If you want the ease of use of the API or get access to some kind of attribution or something that Google does in the background, you can do that as well. And it will send not only to Looker Studio, but multiple destinations. Funnel.io also, it's a warehouse connector. When they extract data, they keep it in their own data warehouse. They take a snapshot for you, they keep it for you, store it for you. Apart from Google, they can get data from other marketing tools as well. And they also have a data transformation layer and historical data backfill, and they will send to multiple destinations as well. I'm not affiliated with any of these, just do your research. These are just two options that are good options are a warehouse data connector that can help not hitting the quotas if you're affected. Cache data connectors, they do not keep data forever in a warehouse, but they will apply a more aggressive caching than Looker Studio does, and maybe in a more smart way. The first one is Supermetrics. What I know is that they limit simultaneous requests to keep from hitting the concurrent request quotas. They have several layers of caching, and they have automatic retries if a request fails. Okay, this is directly from the CEO. So they have a sophisticated caching logic to minimize repeated requests. Older data is cached for longer, newer data is cached for a shorter time, is smart, and it will limit the number of concurrent requests, so it stays below the limit. So it's nice. And this, compared with the new and higher quota limits, compared with the Looker Studio's own caching, should help with many use cases, unless you have a really complicated use case that you require a data warehouse. Power BI Analytics, another very good established data connector. I know that they also cache several fields, and they're adding more, and they're adding more date ranges like weeks, etc. Because like users, you cannot cache them on a daily basis. You have to deduplicate based on different date ranges. So they're doing it as well. And I bet many more third-party data connectors will start caching data more smartly and more aggressively. A special solution for today, for specifically dealing with concurrent request quotas. You saw in the example that we've had 12 scorecards, each one of them sending 2 requests, 24 requests for 12 scorecards. But with a community visualization called Template Pro, something that we in Timecodes Analytics created first for our own usage, and we released it free to the public. It allows creating community visualization with HTML, CSS, and an easy to learn templating syntax. So this is, those of you who know Looker Studio, this can be like 50 different scorecards if you want to do it this way, like 8 bar charts, 8 scorecards, month over month and year over year. I mean, easily 24. But right now it's just one component, one request to the API. So with one component, one request for all of these metrics for the last 14 months, you can create a template to visualize all of them in a way that if you wanted to do it manually with built-in components like a scorecards and bar charts, you needed to create 24, which usually they will need to send at least 48 requests to the API. So immediately, just by thinking about that kind of report, you're hitting your concurrent request quotas. With this one, you are not. I'm still working on it, and I will release it to the public very soon. This is specific template, but Template Pro is available. I've got 6 minutes over time. Time for Q&A. Here's the ways to get in touch with me, and here are the ways to learn Looker Studio with my help. there are other ways as well. Thank you. Q&A in chat. So Part Shah asks, will Supermetric Connector have API quotas? I mean, API quotas are for Google Analytics. Any solution, if you write a script on your computer and try to run it to hit the Google Analytics API, is subject to the quotas. It's the API that doesn't want to answer more questions. It's not the tool that connects to it. So the field is level. Supermetrics is subject to the quotas, yes, but they're aggressively trying to cache the extracted data so that they don't have to hit that API as often as the built-in connector does. Let me look into the chat. So I've got Como. Lee Hurst says, thanks. Thank you, Lee. It's good to hear from you. Glad you find it helpful. Well explained. Thank you. Where we can access the recording post-webinar. I don't know.
Okay. Ahmed, thank you so much for that talk. I think we're just on time at the moment, so with like 2 minutes left.
Okay.
I would suggest I've put the link to Como, which is the networking space, so people can continue the discussion and ask you directly there. In terms of the slides and recordings, we need to just like trim recordings and things like that. So that normally takes us a day or so. So hopefully end of play tomorrow UK time. So that's like 5 p.m. ish tomorrow, as in Friday. If people submit the speaker surveys, the thank you page will have the links to slides, recordings, etc. So basically you got to fill in the speaker survey to get access to resources, basically. On that note, on the speaker survey link is this one. So I should have just posted that in chat, hopefully. So or if people want to get access to the slides before tomorrow afternoon, they can email Ahmed directly. Also, Ahmed, the networking lounge, you've got to kind of navigate to it, but when you move into that, Raisel's going to make your room the default room, so people just all like flow into that one. I did get asked to say that when using Como Space, double click on a speaker's image, and then it will like zoom in on that speaker, and you can hear them and stuff. So we've actually now got about a 20-minute sort of break between the next speaker, which is Jim Stern. So Jim's doing a talk about analytics teams. Ahmed, thank you again for that talk. Some amazing material there. I was so grateful for you sharing that with the audience. I'd suggest that if you've got 50 minutes, if you're around for the next 15-20 minutes, jump over into Como, and people can thank you visually or verbally for sharing that information.
Thank you very much.